Today we're discussing depression. In particular, we're going to talk about major depression. The phrase major depression is used to distinguish one form of depression from the other one being bipolar depression. Bipolar depression, sometimes called bipolar disorder, is really characterized by manic highs, so where people aren't sleeping and they're talking very fast and they're buying things and pursuing resources that they can't afford. They're starting relationships left and right. They're manic, followed by periods of crashes of feeling very low, lethargic, and so on. Bipolar depression is an absolutely crucial thing for us to discuss. Major depression impacts 5% of the population. That is an enormous number. That means if you're in a class of 100 people, 5 of them are dealing with major depression or have at some point. Look around you in any environment and you can be sure that a good portion of the people that you're surrounded by is impacted by depression or will be at some point. So this is something we really have to take seriously and that we want to understand. It is the number 4 cause of disability. A lot of people miss work, miss school, and before then likely perform poorly in work or school due to major depression. Now, there's a very serious challenge in having a discussion about depression, and it relates directly to the challenges in diagnosing depression. Earlier, I did an episode with Dr. Carl Diceroth, who is indeed a medical doctor and a PhD. He's a psychiatrist, and he made a very important point, which is that the field of psychiatry and psychology are confronted with a challenge, which is they're trying to understand what's going on within the stuff that's in our brains, that's deep to our skulls. We don't have access to that without brain imaging and electrodes and things like that. Someone just comes into the office and the dissection tool for depression, so to speak, is language. In order to determine if somebody has depression or not, we have to use language, how they talk about things, also how they carry their body, also some general patterns of health. So let's talk about depression the way that clinicians talk about depression, because one of the issues is that we use the word depression loosely. A lot of people say, I'm so depressed. I didn't get this job, or I'm so depressed. I don't know, I had a really rough week, or I'm exhausted. I'm so depressed, or I'm so depressed. I thought I was going to go on vacation and then they canceled the flight. Okay. That is not clinical depression. That's called being bummed out, being sad, or disappointed. Now, that person might be depressed, but clinical depression actually has some very specific criteria. And those criteria are mainly characterized by the presence of certain things and the absence of a few particular things. So let's talk about the things that are present in somebody that has major depression. First of all, there tends to be a lot of grief. There tends to be a lot of sadness. That's no surprise. The threshold to cry is often a signature of depression. Now, that doesn't mean that if you cry easily that you're depressed. Some people cry more easily than others. But if you're somebody who typically didn't cry easily and suddenly you find yourself crying very easily, that could be a sign of depression. And I want to emphasize could. There's also this thing that we call anhedonia, a general lack of ability to enjoy things. Things that typically or previously we enjoyed. Things like food, things like sex, things like exercise, things like social gatherings. A kind of lack of enjoyment from those things. Sometimes that lack of enjoyment is sad, and sometimes it's just flat. It's just kind of neutral. It doesn't feel good because there's nothing there. It's like bland food. It's like these experiences are analogous to biting into your favorite article of food and it just not tasting very good. It just doesn't taste like anything at all. And that's a common symptom of major depression. The other one is guilt. Oftentimes, people with depression will feel very guilty about things they have done in the past, or they'll just generally feel badly about themselves. And we're going to talk about this because it relates to some of the more serious symptomology seen in depression sometimes, things like self-harm, mutilation, or even suicide. But for the time being, we want to frame up anhedonia, this lack of ability to achieve or experience pleasure, a kind of a flat affect, as it's called. Sometimes even delusional thinking. Negative delusional thinking, and in particular, anti-self confabulation. What is anti-self confabulation? Well, first of all, confabulation is an incredible aspect of our mind and our nervous system. You sometimes see other forms of confabulation in people who have memory deficits, either because they have brain damage or they have age-related dementia. A good example of this would be someone with age-related dementia sometimes will find themselves in a location in the house and not know how they got there. And if you ask them, oh, what are you doing here? They will create these elaborate stories. Oh, I was thinking about going to the shopping today, and I was, and I was going to take the bus, and then I was going to they create these elaborate stories. They confabulate. And yet that person hasn't left the house in weeks, and that person doesn't have a driver's license. And so they're really just creating this stuff. They're not lying to get out of anything. They're confabulating. It's as if a brain circuit that writes stories just starts generating content. In major depression, there's often a state of delusional anti-self confabulation where the confabulations are not directly or completely linked to reality, but they are ones that make the self, the person describing them, seem sick or in some way not well. A good example would be somebody who experiences a physical injury, perhaps. Maybe they break their ankle, maybe it's an athlete, and they also happen to become depressed. And you'll talk to them, you say, how are things going? How's your rehab? And they'll go, oh, it's okay. And I don't know, I feel like I'm getting weaker and weaker by the day. I'm just not performing well. And then you'll talk to the person that they're working with, their kinesiologist or whoever the physical therapist is, and they'll say, no, they're actually really improving. And I tell them they're improving, but somehow they're not seeing that improvement. They're not registering that improvement. And you notice that sometimes it's subtle and sometimes it's severe, but they'll start confabulating. You'll say, I actually heard you're doing much better. You're getting better. You're taking multiple trips around the building now before you could barely get out of bed. And they'll say, yeah, well, basically, they changed some things about the parking lot that make it easier to move around. So it's not really me. And these aren't people that are just explaining away their accomplishments because they're trying to, brush off praise. They are viewing themselves and they are confabulating according to a view that is very self-deprecating, to the point where it doesn't match up with reality. It's not what other people see, and it's actually not matched up with reality. And that's a symptom of depression that I think we don't often think about or conceptualize enough. So it's not just telling people, oh yeah, it's not as good as it seems, everything's bad. These people really believe that, and it becomes disconnected from reality. So it's if they're sort of sinking into a pit and they're losing touch with the realities of the world, including data about themselves, their ability to move and get around. For example, in the particular instance that I used as an example, but there are others as well. The other common symptomology of major depression is what they call vegetative symptoms. Okay, so vegetative symptoms are symptoms that occur without any thinking, without any doing, or without any confabulation. These are things that are related to our core physiology. The word vegetative, you might know, sounds like vegetable. It actually relates to a system in the body that nowadays is more commonly called the autonomic nervous system. The vegetative nervous system and the autonomic nervous system historically were considered sort of one and the same, and it relates to things like the stress response or to our ability to sleep. So vegetative symptoms be things like constantly being exhausted. The person just feels exhausted. It's not because they exercise too much. It's not necessarily because of a life event. It could be, but they're just worn out. They don't have the energy they once had. So it's not in their heads. It's probably, and now I think we have good data to support the fact that there's something off. Something is disrupted in the autonomic or so-called vegetative nervous system. And one of the most common symptoms of people with major depression, one of the signs of major depression, is early waking and not being able to fall back asleep despite being exhausted. So waking up at 3 a.m. or 4 a.m. or 5 a.m. just spontaneously and not being able to go back to sleep. Now, I want to emphasize that could happen for other reasons as well, but it is a common symptom or warning sign of major depression.